Open your Bible, if you would, to the book of Esther. Esther in chapter 2. I want to begin this morning by giving you the theme of our message. The theme of the message this morning is this: God uses surprising people to accomplish unexpected things. God uses surprising people to accomplish unexpected things. Have you ever done this? Have you ever assumed something about a person because of their physical appearance? Assumed that somebody perhaps was athletic because of their build, or assumed something about someone because of their physical appearance in any way. Sometimes people have assumed that I was good at basketball just because I'm over 6 foot tall, but that doesn't necessarily always work out. But I doubt that you or anyone else would have guessed just by looking at him that Audie Murphy would become the most decorated combat veteran in American history. With his trademark baby face that went on to be in the movies, he didn't exactly look like a killer. He didn't exactly look like a very fierce warrior. And in fact, when he was enlisted in World War II, at the time of his enlistment, he was recorded as being 5 foot 5 inches tall and weighing a whopping 112 pounds. Murphy wanted to fight for his country, and in fact tried to enlist in the Army, the Marines, and the Navy, but was turned down every single time. I mean, this person just did not have the persona that you would expect. I mean, he was not the kind of person you expected to go out and fight as a valiant warrior. Well, finally, on his second attempt to enlist in the Army, he was accepted. He was eventually part of the Anzio Beach landing and the invasion of Italy and the liberation of Europe from the Nazis. Murphy was awarded the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and the Legion of Merit, as well as many honors from the country of France. So there's one book that you can't judge by the cover. 5 foot 5, 112 pounds, but did immense damage to the enemy during World War II. A surprising hero who did unexpected things. And perhaps it's paradigmatic of the fact that sometimes you can't read a book by its cover. Sometimes it's surprising people you wouldn't expect that do really unexpected things. Well, God has a way of selecting and using surprising people to accomplish His purposes. And in case you doubt that, just look around. Even here this morning as we gather, we're a surprising bunch of people, aren't we? I mean, the fact that we are here and worshiping the Lord, that we are called to be His children, to me is quite shocking. I mean, there's nothing particularly special about me. I mean, why should I, as a lost sinner, be called into God's family? Called to be holy? Called to preach even? But all of us, each of us have been called out as God's people. And that's a surprising thing because we're just like everybody else. Sinners. Completely without hope and without anything in this world except the promise of judgment. So it's nothing but God's grace that would choose us and use us. We are, we could say, flawed people, every one of us. But that is what makes God's work so surprising. He uses less than perfect people to accomplish His plan. And we see this in the book of Esther. This morning we're going to meet a cast of characters from this book. And they're not perfect people, in fact, far from it. They're surprising people. But through their lives, I think we can see God's hand of providence at work to achieve and accomplish His plan. So look in Esther chapter 2 with me. Now, the initial scene in the book of Esther unfolds in chapter 1. You have this royal tiff that led to an empty throne. The queen, Vashti, has been deposed. She's been actually exiled from the palace. And now, the position of queen is open. And the stage has been set for the events to follow. In fact, our last message was called Setting the Stage. And so now, I think it's appropriate that we should introduce the cast. We should get to know the characters who are going to be a part of this story. And they're introduced to us in chapter 2. And we begin our list of cast members with number 1, the lonely king. The lonely king. Now, we've already talked about King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, his Greek name. But this man, I think, deserves a second look as we get into chapter 2. In fact, let's read together verses 1 through 4. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti and what he had done and what he had decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather up all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women. And let beauty preparations be given to them, and then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king, and he did so. So chapter 2 opens on the lonely king. Now, we've already understood some of his character from chapter 1, but it's going to even become more clear here in chapter 2. Now, it seems a little bit odd to talk about a lonely king, doesn't it? Because a king would be constantly surrounded by servants waiting on him hand and foot. He would have been surrounded by admirers and cabinet members and advisors, military attachés, foreign diplomats. I mean, how could you possibly be lonely when you're constantly surrounded by all these people? And yet, men in positions of leadership and power are often more alone than we would realize. Former U.S. President William Howard Taft is alleged to have referred to the office of president as the loneliest job on earth. Woodrow Wilson, as president, wrote a letter to one of his daughters about the White House. He said, "One could hardly imagine a more empty and forlorn house than this, but I did not expect anything else." Barack Obama, in an interview with 60 Minutes, stated that he was warned by the other former presidents about the loneliness of being president. And I think the king of Persia could probably sympathize with that. Even as he is surrounded by people, there's a loneliness, especially now that he has sent his queen away, the one person that was closest to him. In fact, chapter 2 begins with these words. It says, "After these things." So we have to ask the question, after what things? What's it talking about here? Well, one translation I read said, "sometime later." That seems to be the idea. Time has now passed from chapter 1. Again, the question is, how much time has passed? Well, if we do a little searching here, we'll discover that Vashti and the whole episode of chapter 1 took place in the 3rd year of his reign. Chapter 2, whenever Esther is made queen, it's in the 7th year of his reign, 4 years later. Now, obviously, it could have taken time to go through that whole contest of searching the women of Persia. But nevertheless, several years have now passed from chapter 1. Now, what happened in those years? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us. It just says sometime later. History, however, records that Xerxes had gone on a military campaign against Greece. He had led a massive army up across Turkey and then tried to invade Greece. And the whole thing was a doomed expedition. They came to a place called the Hellespont, which is now the Dardanelles. It connects Turkey and Greece. And they had built several pontoon bridges across this channel of water so that his massive army could cross. Now, a huge storm ended up destroying those bridges, and they had to be rebuilt at excessive cost and extra time. Nevertheless, Xerxes leads his army into Greece, and they gain a couple of small victories, but ultimately his entire fleet of ships is destroyed in Salamis. Now, without the support of his navy and without the ability to resupply, he has to withdraw his army, and the whole campaign is a disastrous failure. And that all takes place between Esther 1 and Esther 2. So the king went from this great, marvelous display of Persian glory in chapter 1 to now he's limping back to Susa with his tail between his legs. He's been defeated. And as he returns to Persia, he doesn't even have a queen to greet him. He's all alone. No comfort, no encouragement from even his queen. He's a lonely king. He comes back to an empty palace and an empty throne. Now, of course, Xerxes had a host of women in his harem, so he didn't lack for physical affection, but he had no queen. He had no one with which he had a deeper connection. Xerxes didn't need a woman, he needed a wife. And that's what the advisors here see. Now, go back to verse 1. It says, the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided. So after the passage of time, he becomes less angry about Vashti's insubordination. And now it seems that in that little phrase, he remembered Vashti. It seems to be some regret creeping in. Like, why did I do that again? That seems sort of stupid now that I look back on it. And there seems to be this regret. Now, it's not that he remembered her as in he had forgotten her, but it's an affectionate remembrance. He remembered the good things about Vashti and not the bad things. It also says in verse 1 that he remembered what he had decreed against her. Remember, the king had made a absolutely unequivocal statement about Vashti. She was banished, never more to return, and he couldn't change that. Nobody could. So there's a regret of having done it, and also the realization that he can't turn it around and go back. And so, what's a king to do? Well, the advisors come up with an idea in verses 2 and 3. The king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king." And so they suggest this action. By the way, it's interesting, the king's servants, it doesn't say who they were. I wonder if it wasn't the same 7 advisors who advised him to get rid of Vashti in the first place. Nevertheless, we don't know. They do suggest, though, that he round up all the beautiful women in Persia, and from those, he can choose one to be his queen. And this search would go throughout all 127 provinces of Persia, which those provinces were divided along ethnic and ethnic lines. So those were from different people groups. So he wasn't looking specifically for a Persian queen, but from all 127 provinces. And these advisors suggest to him, why don't you get them all together and then you can see which one pleases the king. And then in verse 4 it says, this thing pleased the king, and so he did. So begins the drama of Esther. That all these women will be rounded up and they will be brought before the king, and he will choose one to be his queen. So the first member of this cast of characters in Esther is the king. But what does the Bible say about him? Well, let me point out a couple of things that we get to know about Xerxes. Number 1, he was impetuous. He was impetuous. He acted before he thought. And this is a problem that some of us have, isn't it? That sometimes we get so quick on the draw that we never stop to think if we should. And Xerxes was this way. You see him just acting without thinking oftentimes. Good example back in chapter 1. He calls for Vashti to come and present herself before the banquet. She refuses, and he goes off the handle. I mean, he just goes nuts. And at that moment, he makes a decision which later he regrets. By the way, good advice here. Don't make life-changing decisions when you're either drunk or angry, which he was both. And that's exactly what he does here. Impetuous people are often foolish people. Now, that's not the same as being decisive. I mean, it's good sometimes to be able to make decisions and make them quickly if necessary. But impetuous is making rash decisions on the fly, and that's exactly what we see with Xerxes. Later on, he of course regrets that decision he made in chapter 1. But in chapter 3, the king makes sort of a split decision just to decide to execute or annihilate an entire people group in his kingdom without ever actually finding out who those people are. Haman comes to him and says, there's a people in your kingdom and they don't obey your laws and they're troublemakers. Why don't we just sign an edict to wipe them out? And he pretty much gives Haman the rubber stamp and says, let's do it. I mean, not a lot of thought going into these decisions. Later on, his decision to execute Haman, which turns out to be a much better decision than some of his others, is also a split-second decision. He just decides it in the moment. Thucydides, an ancient Greek historian, once said, "Few things are brought to success by impetuous desire, but most by calm and prudent forethought." I wonder if Thucydides was thinking of Xerxes when he wrote that. Impetuous decisions are oftentimes bad decisions. So this king was impetuous. Secondly, he was inept. He was inept. This is the thing that stands out to me as I study the book of Esther more than anything. What a sad excuse for a king. I can only think of two decisions in the entire book of Esther that the king makes of his own judgment. One of them is to promote Haman, which is a terrible decision. The other decision is to execute Haman. So one decision leads to another. The fact is, every time we see the king in this book, he's being told what to do. Chapter 1, Vashti won't obey. His advisors come to him and say, here's what you should do. In chapter 2, he's depressed, having returned to Persia, and it's the advisors who come to him and say, listen, here's what you need to do. Have this contest. Every turn of the book, he's being told what to do by somebody else. Now, on one hand, we wouldn't expect the king to be an expert in everything. So he's going to have advisors, right? Good advisors is a good thing. Even in America today, no president is going to be an expert on foreign affairs in every country. He's going to want to have people around him who know about the situations in Russia or in South America or whatever the country is. He's going to want people that know those situations to inform him because he can't know everything. So we expect the king to have advisors, but like I said, Xerxes in Esther is just inept. No decision he makes on his own. He has to be pretty much told what to do. Even when he decides to execute Haman, which was his own decision, a servant comes along and says, oh, by the way, Haman just erected a gallows in his backyard. Why don't you use that? So even the one decision he does make, or one of the few decisions he makes, he still gets advice on and still has someone kind of walking him through it. This is just the character of the king. The whole book of Esther paints him as being inept. And finally, we see that the king is very shallow in his thinking. And you may have been able to tell this already. But the king is a shallow, superficial type of person. At least that's how he's portrayed here. When he calls Vashti, what was the one thing we know about Vashti? Well, she was very beautiful. What's the one thing the advisors suggest to him in the beginning of chapter 2? Find all the beautiful young virgins. It's almost like there's one characteristic that matters to the king. She's got to be beautiful. Now, there were probably other qualifications too. I mean, if a woman wanted to become king or queen, she would have to have, a certain poise and certain grace and certain, conversational skills to be queens. There were probably other things to be considered. But above all, the king seems most concerned with she needs to be beautiful. And it seems that the king cared about little else besides that. We don't see a lot of depth to this guy. Now, we live in what we could probably call the age of superficiality. Everything today is on a superficial level, and I think that's probably driven along by the internet as well. The internet, everything is about appearances. It's about how you look, or how you can make others think that you look. There's whole dating websites where the whole thing is geared around how do you look? What pictures do you have? And that's about as deep as people go. They're not really interested in personality or real interests, but there's this very superficial level in which a lot of people are living today, where everything's judged by appearances. So we're not really impressed with this king, are we? I'm certainly not, as I've studied Esther. That he just does not seem to be a very discerning, wise king. He's superficial, he's inept, he's ineffective, he's impetuous. So this king of Persia is the first in our cast of characters, and hardly what we would call a good guy. And maybe that's what makes him a surprising member of this cast. God's going to use this ineffective, rather pathetic king, pagan king, in his plan to save his people? The answer is yes. Now, his part will be secondary to our other cast members, perhaps. But God's even going to use this surprising king in unexpected ways. The second member of our cast, though, I want to introduce us to is far from the royal throne. I want to introduce us to number 2, the loyal protector. So the lonely king and the loyal protector. And I'm talking here about Mordecai. Mordecai was a loyal man. That's one of the things that comes out as you study the book of Esther. He's loyal to the king. In one case, even exposing a plot to take the king's life. But more importantly, he is loyal to Esther. Faithful to care for and watch over her. Even when she's in the king's palace, he still seems to keep a fairly watchful eye over what she's doing and making sure that she's okay. So we see the loyal protector, Mordecai. Look in verse 5. In Shushan the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. There's our introduction to him. Now, the Bible says there was a certain man in Susa, which is kind of like a scene change, isn't it? Imagine we're looking at the king up here in the palace, and then we kind of drift across the city, all across the rooftops of Susa, and then down into the street, and there was a certain Jewish man. Nobody particular, nobody special or noteworthy. Mordecai was not some amazing person who stood out from the crowd. He was just an ordinary Jewish man living in Susa. Nothing about him physically or even historically indicates this man is going to be used by God to do something great. He's just regular. I mean, you could have picked out 10 people that looked like Mordecai in Susa. Just an ordinary fellow. And yet, he turns out to be a surprising person too. Because he's going to be instrumental in the story of Esther and God's protection of his people. Now, we learn a few things about Mordecai here. First of all, we learn a detail about his heritage. In verse 5, it says that this man Mordecai was the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, and he was a Benjamite. So the first thing we learn is he was a son of Abraham. He was a Jew, descended from that same lineage, that glorious lineage that they all kept meticulously. I mean, the Jewish people were proud of their tribe and their descent from Abraham. Now, the Bible says there was a certain Jew living in Susa. Why was he living in Susa and not say Jerusalem? Many years before, Ezra had led a group of Jews back to Jerusalem. So why had Mordecai stayed? Why didn't he go back? Well, we're not really told here, but many did not go back. Many Jews chose to stay in Persia. After all, their families had been established there. They had roots in Persia. Why get up and leave? It's the same reason today that many Jews live in America. I mean, the city of New York has as many Jewish people as the nation of Israel does. Why? Why don't they all return to Israel? After all, it's the Jewish homeland. It's the land of their forefathers. Well, many of them have lived their entire lives in America. Their parents grew up in America. Their grandparents. They're pretty thoroughly American. Their businesses are here. Their livelihood is here. Why would they get up and move? And perhaps it was the same in Persia. Mordecai was a third-generation exile. He had known nothing else. Jerusalem, although I'm sure it was a city of significance to him because he was Jewish, but it wasn't his home. Susa was. That's where he had all of his family and all of his extended family, including his cousin, Esther. We also see not only was he a Jew, but he was also of the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin being the youngest of Jacob's sons. The tribe of Benjamin had a significant place in Israel's history. In fact, Saul, the first king of Israel, came from the tribe of Benjamin. So he traces his line back to that group. Now here's an interesting thing. We also see something of his family history, heritage. It mentions here He was the son of Jair, Shimei, the son of Kish. Now here's the big question. Are these direct relatives? In other words, was Kish Mordecai's grandfather, or is it saying he was the son of them, as in they were ancestors from way back? Some people will try and say this, that Saul, the first king of Israel, was the son of Kish. So they'll try to connect the dot here and say, well, Mordecai is the son of Kish in the same way that Saul was the son of Kish. He traces his line back to Saul himself. I, however, take the view that this is a direct lineage. Jair was his father, Shimei his grandfather, and Kish his great-grandfather. Why? Because verse 6 says that Kish, or it really says who had been carried away from Jerusalem. Who? Who had been carried away? I think it's Kish. After all, if Mordecai had been the one who was carried away, he would be 115, 120 years old by the time Esther happens, which means Esther would have been somewhere near 80 when she's entered into this contest. Seems unlikely. Kish, I think, was the one who was carried away into captivity. And now, like I said, Mordecai is a third-generation exile. I know that the names Shimei and Kish both appear in Saul's family tree, but these are different individuals. And I don't think there is a direct, at least a direct line that we can make between Mordecai and Saul. We'll talk about that more later. So we see his heritage. We also see his history. His history. He has lived in Susa his whole life. We see his forefathers mentioned in verse 5. And we also see in verse 6 that Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, the king, or Jehoiakim, the king of Judah. So it appears that Kish, Mordecai's great-grandfather, had perhaps been a noble, somebody who was served in the king's household, or perhaps was an advisor, or some head of household, a prominent figure in Israel, since he was carried away with the king. That would have been the first exile. So perhaps Mordecai has some nobility in his blood. But again, he has lived his whole life in Persia. Now, the Jews in Persia had maintained their Jewish identity. They hadn't assimilated. They hadn't become Persian. They remained Jewish, and so did Mordecai. Finally, though, we learn about his honor. He was a loyal protector. Look at what Mordecai did. Verse 7. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful when her father and mother died. Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. So, his uncle's child, his cousin, Hadassah, Mordecai raises as his own daughter. He cared for her. He watched over her. He took her under his wing when she had no one else. And I think that's commendable for Mordecai. I think it gives us an indication of his honor. He was a protector and a mentor to her. He kept a careful eye on her. Now, Mordecai is not a perfect man, but he appears to have been an honorable man, at least in his treatment of his cousin. Here's what I want to point out about Mordecai, though. He was perfectly ordinary. Just like his Jewish neighbors, other citizens of Susa, nothing particularly special or noteworthy about him. Nothing that would indicate he would be an instrument in the future of Israel. And yet God chooses a surprising person to do unexpected things. Mordecai probably never thought he would be drawn into this incredible series of events. It was a surprise, I imagine, as much to him as it is to us as we read the story. And that's part of the surprise, isn't it? Of how God uses us. We don't oftentimes go out thinking, oh, God's going to use me in this particular way. A lot of times, it just happens. As we go out to serve the Lord, sometimes God uses us in ways we never thought he would use us. He takes us and uses us to encourage someone or to bless someone. Someone comes along your path and you're able to be used of God, and it's like, I never planned that. I never thought I would end up there. Frankly, I never thought I would end up in Trafalgar, Indiana. Yet here I am. The Lord works in surprising and unexpected ways. But finally, the cast would not be complete without the lovely protagonist. The lovely protagonist. We come to Esther. And here's where we first meet our hero. She is revealed to be very beautiful, well-liked, and sometimes Esther is held up as an example of virtue. The story of Esther has often been rehearsed in Sunday school classes, and Esther is extolled as a pattern of faith and godly conviction. Young girls in particular are encouraged to be like Esther, who trusted God and followed him. Esther's placed alongside of Deborah and Ruth and Hannah and Mary as one of the great heroines of the Bible, and a woman worthy of imitation. She's oftentimes admired as having both inner and outer beauty. In other words, the story about Esther is about Esther, and we should follow her example. The question is that the picture of Esther we get from the Bible? Well, let's take a look. Verse 7. Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. So we see first the description of Esther. She's mentioned in verse 7 and given her Jewish name, Hadassah, which means it's a Hebrew word for a myrtle tree. But she's better known by her Persian name, Esther, which either meant star, like a star in the night sky, or it could have been adapted from Ishtar, the goddess of love from Persian culture. Esther was raised by Mordecai, as we've already said. She had neither father nor mother. So her parents died, we're assuming fairly early. From what I could put together, it seems that Esther was probably about 26 to 28 years old when she was brought into the king's household. So the fact that she was raised up, probably from a child, by Mordecai indicates her parents likely died early in her life. But here's the big thing that we recognize about Esther. Verse 7. She was lovely and beautiful. It's her physical appearance the Bible seems to highlight here. Now, the Hebrew text is a little more descriptive. It might be translated, she was beautiful in form and lovely to look at. In other words, Esther turned heads wherever she went. She was very attractive. Now, why is that important? Well, we've already said the king is looking for all the attractive young women in the kingdom. And she fits that description. It seems interesting to me, though, that Esther, it's her physical description that's most highlighted here. When I think of Esther, I was thinking this week about Grace Kelly. Remember Grace Kelly? She was a movie star from the 1950s, and kind of up-and-coming actress. And her breakout role was in High Noon opposite Gary Cooper in 1952. But pretty soon she became a leading lady in Hollywood, and she caught the attention of a lot of the leading men in Hollywood because she had this elegant beauty to her. Well, not only did she catch the eye of a lot of men in Hollywood, she also caught the eye of royalty. The Prince of Monaco eventually married Grace Kelly in 1956, and she became Grace of Monaco. And it's a very famous story. You may remember some of her films. But it seems Esther had the same quality. She was also recognized by royalty and noticed. Her beauty is sort of front and center here in her description. But also, let's look at her experience. Verse 8, the experience of Esther. So it was when the king's command and decree was heard, and when many young women were gathered in Shushan the citadel under the custody of Hegai, that Esther was also taken to the king's palace and into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance of food. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. So the order is carried out, and the women are gathered up from around the kingdom, including Susa or Shushan. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly how it was carried out. How did they identify these people? How did they round them up? Were they taken by force? Well, the Bible does say Esther was taken. It's a passive verb. In other words, she didn't have an option. It wasn't that she went, it's that she was taken. It's not like Esther heard, hey, there's an opportunity to become queen here. I'm going to jump into this contest. She was taken. I don't think she had much of a choice. Now, it doesn't say anything about her resisting it either. But, and this time, I guess it was a liability to be beautiful. And so she's taken, and she's transported to the palace and placed under the care of Haggai. This was one of the eunuchs who took care of the women. He was responsible for preparing them for their debut with the king. So no doubt this involved, beauty preparations are specifically mentioned here, but it also probably included training with how do you address the king. These were commoners. They didn't know how to talk in the royal court. Proper court etiquette. How do you handle yourself before the king and so on. He was responsible for that. And apparently he took a liking to Esther in verse 9. He gave her above and beyond what the other women had. She really made an impression on him. Now, next week we'll talk more about the actual contest, if you will, and the circumstances that surrounded Esther's rise to the throne. But let's get on to an evaluation of Esther. What are we to make of Esther? Last week we talked about Vashti. Was she right? Was she wrong? Was she a role model of courageous virtue or a flawed figure? And we can ask the same thing about Esther. Should we come away seeing Esther as a model of godly purity and commitment to the Lord, or something else? What does the Bible tell us to think about Esther? Well, it doesn't. It just puts her out there before us and gives us what she did and her choices and so on, but it never gives us sort of a God's eye view of Esther. She did right on the side of the Lord. She did wrong on the side of the Lord. It doesn't tell us. We're left to sort of decide ourselves a little bit. And so some people take a very positive view of Esther. Some take a less positive view of Esther. This leads me to one little observation that's very, very important. So the book of Esther nowhere includes the name of God. In fact, God seems suspiciously absent from the book of Esther, doesn't he? And let me make this little observation. When God is absent, there is no way to really make moral evaluations, is there? In other words, if we don't invoke God, if God's not present, who's to say what's right or wrong? What's good or bad? It's all sort of relative, isn't it? We can just sort of decide ourselves. Unless you have a God who says clearly here is right, here is wrong, then everything's kind of up for grabs, isn't it? And this is the dilemma that the atheist has. The atheist says, well, there is no God. Well, then what makes the Holocaust wrong? What makes murder wrong? Well, we all sort of know that it's wrong. Well, okay, why? We would say it's because we have the law of God written on our hearts. That there is a moral creator who made everything and has instilled within us a sense of what is right and wrong. But the atheist can't say that. And so everything is just sort of this wishy-washy middle of, well, everything is sort of based upon circumstances. Right for you, right for me, depends on the occasion. And so Esther, it seems, it's almost as if because this book does not bring God into it, it also doesn't bring these evaluations. It doesn't tell us about the character. Now, what do we see about Esther's character? And I don't mean to burst any bubbles here, but I kind of take a lower view of Esther's character. Now, I think she was a courageous person, and I think she's a really remarkable person in a lot of ways. But godly? I don't know. Let me point out my reasons for why I think that she is maybe not the model of purity. Number one, she ate unclean foods. So in verse 9, it says that she was given a portion of meat when she went into the king's palace. Now, she presumably ate that. Compare that with Daniel, who was also in Persia, Babylon. And the Bible says in Daniel chapter 1 that Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's food. So Daniel kind of makes a stand and says, no, I will not compromise, not even on this. Whereas Esther seems to go in with both eyes open and doesn't seem to have any qualms with eating not kosher food. So instead of Daniel, who stands on his integrity and his conviction in a pagan culture, Esther seems to slide along quite well. One author said, "She does not display the Judaism at all costs spirit that distinguishes Daniel." I think that's right. So she ate unclean food. Second, she kept her identity secret. You notice verse 10? Esther had not revealed her people, her family, because Mordecai had told her not to reveal it. So no one knows Esther's Jewish. We'll talk about maybe why Mordecai would have asked her to keep quiet later. But the fact that she kept quiet means a couple of things, right? She wasn't observing the Sabbath. That would have been a clear and obvious thing that people would have noticed. She wasn't keeping and eating kosher. She wasn't keeping the Old Testament laws. She was not praying like Daniel was. Daniel was praying through the window, and everyone knew it. So she manages to keep a low profile. No one knows she's a Jew at all. So she keeps her identity secret. Number 3, she married a Gentile king. Now, you could argue that she had no choice in this, that she was just dragged along, and that may be true. But consider this. She goes into a contest in which pleasing the king is how you win. And she seems to go at it with such enthusiasm that she ends up capturing the king's heart. So it seems like she was not just an unwilling, just forced to go through with this. It seems that she really excelled at this. And she marries this Gentile king. Now, some later Jewish authors had a problem with this. Because Esther's the hero of the story. She's such a great person. How do we explain this? And so a later Jewish community added some verses to Esther, including a little prayer that was put into Esther's mouth. And one author, John Whitcomb, states, "Centuries later, perhaps about 100 BC, a Jewish writer attempted to paint Esther as a highly spiritual woman by putting this prayer into her mouth. 'You know everything, and you know that I hate the pomp of the wicked, and I loathe the bed of the uncircumcised and of any foreigner.'" In other words, words were added to try to clear up and to make Esther seem perhaps more upright than the text implies. So she married a Gentile king. And then number 4, she never mentions God, along with the rest of the book. Now later on, we do have a brief mention of fasting in chapter 4, but you don't see in her the sort of Godward, God-centered attitude you see in some of the other heroes of the Bible, do you? I mean, she's not talking about the Lord, praying to the Lord, casting herself upon God. In fact, she and Mordecai seem oddly silent about God. So if Esther is a prime example of a godly young lady, we would expect her to trust in the Lord and seek him earnestly. But the book is characterized by this deafening silence about God. Highly unusual for a person being touted as a stellar example of faith. So don't get me wrong, I think Esther has a lot of great qualities. But I don't think that she is a perfect person. I don't even think that she was necessarily a particularly godly person. And that's what makes it so surprising. That God doesn't use just some hero of the faith, doesn't call in Abraham or Moses. He uses this young woman who has some flaws, who has maybe even some moral compromise in her life. She is still used in some way. That's what makes this whole thing so unexpected. So a couple of observations about Esther before we close the message. First of all, as we look at Esther, I want to remind us that courage is not the same as character. Courage is not the same as character. I believe that Esther is a courageous person, no doubt about it, especially chapter 5, where she goes into the king at the risk of her own life to save her people. She's courageous. But courageous does not always mean godly. I think that Esther is courageous in the same way that Samson is courageous. Samson did amazing things. He defeated God's enemies. God used Samson. But I'll tell you what, he was a flawed individual, wasn't he? There were a lot of things in Samson's life I wouldn't encourage you to go out and follow and imitate. Well, Esther is in a similar way, heroic, but not always a person of great character. And I think this is a good reminder for us. Courage is not the same as character. think we need both if we're going to be people who honor and please God. Secondly, beauty is no substitute for integrity. So Esther, of course, was extremely attractive. She impressed everyone she met. Her outward beauty was even irresistible to the king. But outward beauty does not always indicate, or rarely indicates, a life of integrity underneath. Compare Esther with the other Old Testament book named for a woman. So Esther and Ruth are the only books in the Old Testament named for a woman. Ruth, we have no physical description whatsoever in the book. We know nothing about the way Ruth looked. But we know a lot about her character by the way she acts. And Ruth's character is just outstanding. Now Esther, we know a lot about how she looked, but when we start to look at her character, I don't know, there's some things that cause me to sort of slow down and question. But let me rephrase this a little bit. Beauty is no substitute for integrity. We could change that with a lot of things, couldn't we? Success is no substitute for integrity. There's a lot of people who would sacrifice their integrity to be successful. Popularity is no substitute for integrity. Acceptance is no substitute for integrity. We could go on. There's a number of things that could fit in here. It's not just beauty, but any number of things people will sacrifice their integrity to get. I think that's a warning here from the book of Esther. So what we see here is God using surprising people in unexpected ways. And we're going to see exactly how God uses them. Now, our cast is not yet complete because the major villain is going to appear in chapter 3. We'll talk more about him later. But these three, our lonely king, our loyal protector, and our lovely protagonist, form the main characters of this story. As we close this morning, let me note a couple more things before we finish. Number one, as we think about Esther 2, 1-10, we're reminded, number one, to beware the temptation of assimilation. You know, Esther fits in so well. In fact, nobody even suspects that she's Jewish. And that's one of the temptations we're going to face, and we face in the 21st century, is to fit in with modern culture. Beware the temptation of assimilation. Number two, we need both courage and character. Not one over the other. We need both. And folks, we need courage now more than ever, right? The courage to stand for the Lord. Even as we speak this morning, things continue to unfold, but this morning in California, there's a church in Ventura, California, in which if you go to church this morning, there's a good chance that the government has threatened that you will be cited with a misdemeanor for disobeying a court order, just for going to church and worshiping. Folks, we're going to need courage if this is the world, if this is the way things continue to go. We need courage and character, not one without the other. Number three, only God's perspective makes sense of right and wrong. As we look at the book of Esther, there's a certain moral ambiguity to the whole book. You know, who's right, who's wrong? You know, there seems to be this sort of, the Bible never really states. And that's because we need God's perspective. Only God can make sense of right and wrong. Only God makes sense if we're to actually say, yes, some things are right, some things are wrong, some things are good, some things are bad. We have to understand that only comes through a biblical understanding of the world, looking at the world through God's eyes, looking at it through Scripture and that worldview. So let us embrace that type of worldview. And may we be warned by this cast of characters to the dangers, but also encouraged that God continues to work, even with these surprising and unexpected people.